Okay, so I forgot to do something about the Irish. The Irish, when they come to America, bring a distinct musical tradition, to say the least. I don't know what it is about the Irish, but they're a very musical people. In some ways, I kind of wondered if it's the same kind of thing as with African Americans. The music of oppression, expression of oppression, relatively few avenues of expression, so you turn to the ones that are available to you, and music is often one of those things you can do. So the Irish become a tremendously musical people. They were musical in Ireland. They're musical today, as you probably know. When they came to America, they're going to bring that music with them. So I'm going to sing you an Irish-American song from the antebellum period. The song has to do with men that were working on the railroad. It's a common kind of refrain for the Irish at that time. The song is called Tributaries Trill, and you can see right from the title kind of, some of the issues of the Irish. They're calling themselves terriers, and of course terriers are dogs, and I think that's the self-depreciating humor that they would often have. But they're building the railroad, and they come to some hard rock situation, and so they would have to have these, they're about 3 foot long cast iron drills, and I've actually got one. I found one of these out in the desert. It's a cast iron drill, and one guy would hold the drill in his hand while another one would swing a sledgehammer down on that. And the guy holding it would, of course, hold it, absorb the shock, turn it, and again, and have to absorb it. And of course, the two of them had to have a really tight relationship, because if that guy swinging misses, he's going to really do damage to the person who's holding on to it. And they would drill a hole that was about 8 inches deep or something like that. Then a bunch of them around it. They would pack them with black powder, and then they would blow. And hopefully you'd make like 8 inches, 10 inches of movement through the rock and bands through the rock, and then do it all over again. That's simply the way that it had to work for them. So the song kind of is indication. It kind of shows us about that particular activity. And the song is meant to be mildly amusing, as almost everything I try to do is mildly amusing. We'll see if you can hear the humor. But this song is called, excuse me, Tributaries Trill. Well, early in the morning, it's 7 o'clock. There's 15 terriers working at the rock, and the boss comes around and he says, keep still. And come down heavy on your cast iron drill, and drill, ye terriers, drill. Drill, ye terriers, drill. Well, you work all day for the sugar in your tea, down behind the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill, and blast, and fire. Well, the boss was a fine man down to the ground, and he married a woman 6 foot round, and she baked good bread, and she baked it well. She baked it hard as the holes in hell, and drill, ye terriers, drill. Drill, ye terriers, drill. Well, you work all day for the sugar in your tea, down behind the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill, and blast, and fire. Well, our new foreman was Jim McCann. By golly, Jim was a mean hard man. One day a premature blast went off, and a mile in the sky went Big Jim Goff, and drill, ye terriers, drill. Well, when the next payday come around, Jim Goff $1 short was found. When asked the reason, came this reply: you were docked for the time then you spent in the sky, and drill, ye terriers, drill. Drill, ye terriers, drill. Well, you work all day for the sugar in your tea, down behind the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill, and blast, and fire. So I have no idea how you're reacting to that, if you like it or not. But anyway, the Irish had a number of different songs that they would sing during this time. Another expression, of course, the Irish situation. Now, the Irish weren't alone in being a major component of the immigration, representing the dynamic growth in Antebellum America. Okay, there were other groups that were coming. So the second largest group of immigrants who will come to America in the antebellum period, and I would want you to guess, but if you don't, here's my hint: beer. We had whiskey for the Irish, so we're using beer. So I'm hoping that you are saying or thinking to yourself that the second largest group of immigrants to America were the Germans. So we see the Germans coming to America between 1848 and 1860, about 1.3 million. Really, the Irish and the Germans are the major makeup of immigration to America as far as the antebellum period is concerned. Now, I'm not going to use the Germans for potential identification, but I do want to tell you their story, and they're part, of course, of the immigration component of the dynamic growth of America. But their story is also a push story. You know, when the Europeans say push, they're not making that up. You know, there is something to that, right? So, here's the story of the Germans. It's maybe something you're not quite as familiar with. In 1848, a major event occurred in Europe, and it's often called the Revolutions of 1840. And the reason I did the hand quotes is because whenever you see it say the Revolutions of 1840, it's always in quotation marks. And the primary reason is because it's a big event and a lot of stuff happened, but in the end it kind of all falls apart, so it doesn't really happen in the way that they think it's going to happen. So it started in Paris in 1848. Frenchmen disaffected with the situation right there, kind of remembering the dynamics of the revolution, throwing barricades up, of course, all over the city, and quite a bit of violence is going to ensue. And the revolutionary activity in Paris, in France, then began to generate similar activity all across Europe. I mean, there was a lot of just simmering hostility at that time, of course, a lot of different things. Nationalism, increased democracy, these things are going on at that time. And so just an explosion sort of activity on the part of the Europeans. You're going to see it happen in Germany. You're going to see it happening in in Austro-Hungarian Empire. You're going to see it happen in Poland, all over the place. There's like these explosions. And, and the elites, especially members of the aristocracy, like were scared to death, because they remember the French Revolution. Everyone's getting their heads chopped off, and they think that something like that's going to happen again. So in the moment of terror for these elites and these aristocrats, there's actually a chance of kind of maybe change taking place as far as Europe is concerned. In the long run, those people in positions of power, monarchs and others, will reestablish control over those situations. So it's like a flowering of activity. It was quite exciting, to say the least, and then all of it pretty much suppressed in a very kind of profound way. Now, what happened in Germany is interesting. The Germans were not a country. They were a language and a culture, basically, and powerful culture, to say, music and literature and all these kind of things. But they didn't have a country. Germany was made up of lots of different entities, of course, monarchies like Bavaria and Prussia, Hesse-Darmstadt, principalities, margraves, free cities. I can't remember the numbers, but like there's a time when there's 40 different things that are Germany. It's not just one place; it's 40 different things that are Germany. But in the moment of 1848, there was a feeling that maybe the Germans could all come together and create a united Germany. And the only major issue was, should it be the Kleindeutsch, that's the little Germany, that would be the Germany that we think of, or the Grossdeutsch, all Germans, including the Austrians. And, at that moment, they're going to go for the Kleindeutsch, the smaller Germany, excluding the Irish, or it's not Irish, but the Austrians and the other German-speaking people. So in Germany, there is a welling up of a feeling of creating a nation. There's a bunch of people who come to Frankfurt. They create what they call the Frankfurt Parliament. It's a parliamentary entity. They create a constitution for a unified Germany that is very liberal, that is very much in the American line, basically. And there's these just incredibly high hopes that they are now creating a liberal, universal manhood suffrage, united Germany. And, they're super excited about the whole thing. Now, the only problem was that there were still these, individual entities. Like the King of Prussia was still there, and the King of Prussia had a very substantial army. And after kind of a moment of panic, where they're all like, "Oh no, it's going to be a revolution. We're going to, get killed," they began to realize maybe it's not quite what we think it is. And so the King of Prussia, using his extraordinarily talented prime minister, whose name was Otto von Bismarck, you may have heard of Bismarck before, began to mobilize the Prussian army, and they will ultimately move to quash this movement of this attempt to create a Republic of Germany, unified Germany under Republican form. In the aftermath of this, of course, and the dreams of the Frankfurt Parliament are shattered, to say the least. Otto von Bismarck will say this famous statement. He says, "Germany will not be united by men with pens and high ideals." In other words, those who would sit down and write out a constitution. Instead, he said, Germany will be united by, and I have to say it in German to give the power, Blut und Eisen. So blood and iron. And it's exactly true. The Prussian military will be the force of the unification of Germany through a series of wars, ending up with the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which will finally create the unified Germany, not as a republic, of course, but as the Kaiserreich, with the King of Prussia becoming the German Kaiser or the German Emperor. And of course, a much more authoritarian and much more militaristic situation that will, there's going to be some hell to pay for that, of course, as we enter into the 20th century. So what that meant, though, was there's this massive failure on the part of these Germans who were trying to create a unified republic. And as I told you, a whole bunch of them saying, hell no, 1.3 million of them said, we're not going to put up with that. And they left. I'm sure they were tremendously sad to have to leave Germany, but they're going to leave and they're going to come to the United States of America. Now, there's a real difference between the Germans and the Irish in coming to America. The Irish come to the bottom of American society and really suffer that situation. The Germans make a more lateral movement. Many of them were members of the middle class. Many of them were educated. Many of them were professionals. Many of them were skilled craftsmen. And when they move to America, they're not going to come into the bottom of American society. They're going to move right into wherever they came from Germany. It's like this lateral movement. And because they come with relative wealth and talents and abilities, there's significantly less discrimination, hostility to the Germans than there were to the Irish. So the German story is very, very different than the Irish story. Now, just as a way to suggest you kind of the dynamics of lateral movement for the Germans, I want to tell you about this guy by the name of Karl Schurz, and I've kind of complicated by putting Karl and his wife together. Karl Schurz. Karl Schurz was a member of the Frankfurt Parliament, so he was part of this effort, of course, to try to create the unified republic in Germany, and then it fails. Well, he comes to America. He quickly becomes part of the activities of the Republican Party, and by the time we get to 1861, he's a member of Lincoln's cabinet. I mean, heavy German accent, but he was part of the Republican administration. So that's what I call lateral movement, the highest level of German political activity to the highest level of American political activity. Now, to be honest with you, the most important person of this group right here, though, on the card is not Karl, who is a demonstration of lateral movement, but his wife, Marguerite. And Marguerite does something that has a huge impact, and indeed, I would suggest it impacted me. I'm guessing it might have impacted you too. So let me tell you about Marguerite. Marguerite Schurz comes to America, and one thing she saw right away was that she didn't like the way the Americans deal with the educational system, especially at the lowest level. She felt the Americans take little kids and they just throw them into school, and they expect them to know everything, of course, and deal with kind of the long hours and all that kind of stuff. So not liking that, she decided to introduce a German institution. And this was like a moving into education institution where the little kids would come in and they would have a shorter day and they would have more playtime, of course, and they might even have nap time and stuff like that to ease their way into the educational apparatus instead of just like throwing them right into it, okay? And I don't know if you guys have any guess what's going on, but it was Marguerite Schurz who will introduce to America der Kindergarten, the kindergarten. And of course, the kindergarten just means the children's garden, a way of kind of easing. I know that we have pre-K and all kinds of stuff now, but this was, the first notion of how do you ease the child into the educational experience. I still can remember things about kindergarten. I went to Madison School in Riverside. Sometimes I drive by there. I see the playground where the kindergartens have their own special playground, of course. But here is my claim to fame in kindergarten. There was one day where I was the most famous kindergartner on the playground. What happened was that I got stung by a bee on my right arm. I can still remember, just like see it almost, okay? And whatever happened, the bee didn't quite do it right. And so the bee and the stinger were left on my arm. The bee died and the stinger was right there. And and I could go to every single student in the yard and say, look, I had a bee try to sting me, but it doesn't hurt, And for 15 minutes, I was the most famous person there, to be honest with you. So, I had my great moment. Now, of course, I always wondered, what was wrong with that bee? And the only thing I could come up with is, that the bee kind of screwed up because it was a kindergarten bee, and it really didn't understand how you're supposed to do it. When I got stung in graduate school, that was a PhD, and that sucker really hurt. Patunk. No one's laughing. Okay, I get that. But anyway, that's the only PHB joke I can come up with for you guys. Anyway, Marguerite Schurz introduces the kindergarten, of course, and I went to kindergarten, and maybe some of you went to kindergarten too. Now, I do want to say that there were a few other groups of immigrants that are coming, so I want to give them their props. There are a significant number of Scandinavians, though we are looking now in the tens of thousands rather than the millions, of course, that would be coming. We see an influx of Scandinavians, so people from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, primarily coming to the northern part of the United States. In fact, even farther to the west in the northern part, Scandinavians become part of the equation. Another critically important group that will become part of the United States and add to the population base. Now, this is a little bit of a different story. So they're really not immigrants. They were simply living where they were living, and they didn't come to America, but America kind of came to them and took them over. Now, I don't know what you guys are thinking right now, but what I'm not talking about are the Native Americans. Remember that we would never discuss Native Americans when we're talking about demographic growth because their population is going down, okay, throughout this entire period. So even though the United States might begin to subsume more Native American tribes, that's not who we're talking about because no matter what, their population goes down. So instead, I'm talking about people who would have lived, for instance, in Texas, in California, And of course, when I say New Mexico, I give it away absolutely. So we do see a significant number of Mexicans becoming part of the United States of America. And not so much that they came to America, that didn't happen, but America came to them when it took over Texas, when it took over Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico, when it took over California. I don't know what the absolute number is here. I'm thinking it's probably less than 50,000 Mexicans that were part of that area. All those areas were thinly, sparsely populated areas as far as Nuevo Mexico or Nueva España, and ultimately Los Estados Unidos de Mexico. This wasn't a huge population. In fact, that's the issue in some ways. But those who lived in those areas, of course, will simply be taken over. I always like to mention the Californios because I kind of love that group of people. I love when I get to talk about them in California history. These were the people who were the descendants, essentially, of the soldiers and the people who came to the pueblos during the Spanish period in California. We call them they call themselves the Californios. And I just think it's so interesting, of course. They didn't call themselves Spaniards. They didn't call themselves Mexicans, the Californios, because they identified with their particular area. We're looking at about 8,000 at the ultimate expression of the Californios. The critical thing is that they lived in this incredibly isolated location, California, but they developed this unique and, to me, really kind of attractive pastoral lifestyle. They were all a bunch of ranchos. California in that moment, it's from the end of the missions and the Spanish period, so that's 1821 till the time the Americans take over, which is in 1846. So it's a very short period, it's only 25 years long. When I do it in California history, it's the California moment. But these people lived in California. They built their ranchos, of course, and those ranchos always seem really attractive to me, a place to go. They had tremendous number of cattle. We estimate that the 8,000 people had close to 500,000 head of cattle. So if you do the math, we're looking at, 30 cows for every single person, of course. That meant you're not going to go hungry ever. And it wasn't against the law to kill a cow in California. You couldn't take the hide because the hide was the economically valuable thing. But if you're cruising California and you're hungry and it's late, kill a cow, eat part of the cow. That's going to be totally legitimate kind of activity. But the Californians lived this pastoral ranching lifestyle. And for those that were the elite, not everyone, of course, was wealthier, but you have the great rancho families, ranchero families that we see up and down in California, Sepulveda, Nieto, Don Lugo, just Bandini, one after another, Mariana Vallejo, way up in the northern part, of course, in Sonoma. They lived these kind of very interesting lives. It was boring and tedious as you think about it. Just the quietude of California must have been amazing. But one thing that they loved to do was to be hospitable, and they loved to have their parties, their fiestas, and their fiestas would go for days. Not a day or not an hour, but days. It was just a way to all get together, to have some fun, of course, to share the food that they had, and of course they would pit barbecue like a calf every single day, so a tremendous amount of beef there, and other things, wine and things that they could consume. But in the midst of their fiestas, you had the patron and the patrona, so that's the Don and his wife, who are the prominent members of the family, and all they would want to do, of course, is entertain everybody as much as they possibly could. One thing they loved to do at these fiestas was to sing and dance, and because I have la guitarra, I'm going to quickly play you guys a song that apparently was sung by the Californios, and I'm sure you guys have heard of this before, just the one verse of it real quickly. De la sierra morena, cielito lindo, viene embajando un par de olitos negros, cielito lindo de contrabando. Ay, 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 canta y no llores, porque cantando se alegran, cielito lindo, los corazones. There you go. Anyway, so there were Mexicans also becoming part of the larger American population. Then one final group of immigrants who came to America in the antebellum period. You have the Atlantic migration, which dominates, no doubt about that, but you could also argue that there was something of a emerging Pacific migration. And the people who came, they were called the Gumsanhak, and I'll show you that just in a second. But if you translate that, that means the guests of Gold Mountain, the guests of Gold Mountain. And of course, that kind of suggests you what is the drawing factor here. They're clearly responding to the dynamics of the gold rush. But you have somewhere around 60,000 Chinese that came to California beginning around 1848 and will continue until about 1860. They came to California, and I have to tell you that in many ways they were kind of like the moral equivalent of the Irish on the East Coast. And that meant that they came, they were always seen as a group apart. They were discriminated against in fairly significant ways, of course, and it becomes part of the tragic story. But just extraordinary source of labor for California, especially first in mining, later to build the railroads. I mean, one of their most heroic acts was while the Irish are building the railroads coming from the Transcontinental Railroad from the east, it was the Chinese. 12,000 Chinese was actually the largest construction force in the world at that time. We're building the Central Pacific, out of Sacramento across the Sierra, heading towards the east. Of course, their barriers were so significant; they had to go through the Sierra Nevada. We see this in that they had to do what they called the boomer cut. This 800-foot cut. I don't know, it's like 100 feet deep, massive cuts through it. They had to build bridges, of course. They had to build honking tunnels. One of them was called the Summit Tunnel. Super hard granite up in the summit area of the Sierra Nevada, where they would drill, all day long, and sometimes they would only make a few inches a day, and it took them the better part of a year to get through this. I think it's just about a quarter-mile tunnel. They built the Great Wall of China. This was where they had to build up the rock to support where the train would have to go around an edge. They also did this famous little cut called Cape Horn. So way above the American River, on the side of a cliff, they had to cut an opening right in the granite there. And one thing, it's kind of the similar thing I told you about the Irish. The Irish are doing the, drilling, of course, and blasting. Chinese had to do the same thing, and they would put them on like a little rope, like a swing. They would sit down on a rope that would dangle them down, and these guys would have to do it just sitting against the rock face with a hand drill and a hand sledge, and just drilling into this hard rock. And they would do the pattern situation. They would pack with black powder, and then of course they would light it up to try to begin to beat away the rock. The Chinese had this interesting behavior at this moment, though, a kind of unique fatalism in which they thought if it was their time to go, it's going to be their time to go no matter what. So the story is that they would drill their holes, they would pack with black powder, and they would short fuse it. So they wanted just a short fuse. And they didn't want to have to climb all the way up and then climb all the way back down, so they would simply light the fuse, and then they would kick away. So they'd swing themselves away as far as they possibly could. And of course, ideally, you swing away, the fuse hit the powder, they blow, and then you swing back, of course, into kind of just the dust of the after effect of the explosion. Sometimes it didn't quite go that way. Can you imagine being at the end of the swing and like, oh no, going back, of course, and it hasn't yet blown just at that time. But the sense was, of course, that if it was your time, it's your time. So it didn't seem to bother them too much. But the Chinese will come; they will provide a critical source of labor for, especially California, building public works, ultimately becoming the first significant non-Indian labor force in California. But they're also, of course, becoming part of the population growth through immigration in America in the antebellum period. And please note, of course, because I always want you to know this is important to me, that as these groups come, they are also adding to the cultural diversity of America. It's a critical component of just the continuing development of America, not just in the antebellum period. I'm going to take a break now and get back to you as soon as I can.